Well, good evening, y'all. Good evening. On the cusp of a fall break when you are hanging by a thread, trying to figure out how you're going to get papers written and tests done. I just want to thank you all for taking the time to be a part of this across the institution read. This is our inaugural read. I don't think it will be our last, and I'm so looking forward to this conversation. Let me start with a few thanks before I introduce the president, and then I'll come back and introduce our speaker. I want to start by thanking Alicia Orsina for her hospitality and for the students and staff who helped her make sure things were clean and in their proper place. Thanks to Liz Boyer, who unfortunately is not with us tonight, but is online with the 51 other people who signed up to be online. So yay. For making sure that everybody who wanted it got some version of the book. For her pedagogical reflective walk around the campus and for everyone who helped her. And if you have not taken the walk, I'm just going to keep saying, please take the meditative walk. They are going to stay up for probably another month before we take them down. Thanks to Chef Brian and the kitchen staff for the meal we just enjoyed. I just really appreciate him for doing that. And our speaker said, I didn't even miss the meat. It was so good. Thanks to those who were called the dedicated readers who prepared for the conversation tonight. They are by name April Blaine, who is a graduate of this institution and now teaches, Brad Price, who teaches here as in pastoral care, Renisha Warren in her second year, as a student, MDiv student, Courtney Williams. I actually don't know what your degree is. Sorry, Courtney. You said you don't either. Daniel Heck, also a student, first full year. Vincent Slocum, who is not with us tonight, but maybe online, just could, family emergency. Shimmer Roberts, who is in her second year and is also student trustee. Melissa Jeter, who I assume is online. I didn't check, but I'm betting. Brian, the chef, was the first person to sign up to read, and he was so excited that he did, in fact, read. And I understand that he was fussing at students who were saying they had not read. So there you go. Tennille Power, who is in her second year. Laura Ann Bergman, who is our one of our land care persons and also a student. Dr. Christopher Carter, who will be helping us in this conversation. Kathy Dixon, who is over interns and contextual learning among 11 other things she does. Claudine Leary, who is also an administrator here raising money. You should always thank God for Claudine, because if you have any kind of scholarship, she has helped make that happen. And Elenda Clay, who is not here because she's still not feeling well, but is online, our librarian who helped us choose this book. Thank you also to the president for supporting this inaugural read across the institution, for the staff, students, administrators, alum, and board members who agreed to participate. Thank you to those who are online and to those of you who are gathered here. And now, Mr. President, if you will come and greet us.
Thank you, Dean Valerie.
You're at quite an event where there's someone who introduces someone who's going to introduce the someone who will introduce the speaker. Not sure what my role is, but I do want to welcome you. It's so good to see all of you out on a fairly chilly night. Some of you are here, I think, for the first time. Welcome. For those of you who come here as a part of your pattern, keep coming back again and again. This is an inaugural read. Last spring, there was some conversation about how we might work together around some of our common commitments and concerns. A little earlier, I had a chance to talk with our speaker today, and he asked a very poignant question that none of us had an answer for. Do you have a common definition of social justice? And we kind of stumbled over that, and I think our excuse was, well, we do it. We don't know if we can define it. We work at that. I think tried to share back with him that while we find a lot of commonality, we don't necessarily have unanimity, and we think that's okay. And so coming up with something, a definition that everyone could live with once and for all probably isn't the goal, which I think we share that understanding. Amazing that as we were thinking about what could pull us together in the fall last spring, we thought of a common read, because yes, we did know that you would all be immersed in your syllabi and that you would be reading everything under the sun, and we thought the best thing to do would be to find another book. About 2/3 of the people I've talked to so far haven't read the thing because we've been listening to it on audio. I hope you thought of that because you did enough reading. But a welcome to all of you, and Jemar is in time. All right. You're next.
Yeah, I'm going to introduce him. Come on in, Dr. Tisby. Yay! Put the hashtag back up while he takes a seat. I want to explain to you that this is a closed gathering, and yet you are free to tweet or X, whatever they call that now, Facebook, Instagram, any quote, anything that happens here, we have the permission of Dr. Tisby to do that. You can take pictures, but, be careful. Just be careful. And I hope that you are prepared to buy. If you don't have the book and you want to buy the book, we have that book plus more books, different books that he has, and the t-shirt. Are you wearing the t-shirt that he's wearing right now? Justice Takes Side. I have my money. I hope you're ready. We're going to all be looking like twins, triplets, quadruplets before it's over. Dr. Tisby is a renowned writer, speaker, and professor who's dedicated his life to becoming a lifelong leader in the movement for racial justice. He is committed to educating people about the history of racism in America and to empowering them to take action to bring change. Born and reared near Chicago, his educational journey began at the University of Notre Dame, where he graduated magna cum laude in American Studies and Theology, and is proud to say that he never missed a home football game. You Ohioans can forgive him. He went on to become a core member in the Teach for America program. He was placed in the Mississippi Delta on the Arkansas side and taught 6th grade science and social studies. After several years teaching, he became principal of a middle school. Dr. Tisby then went back to school to earn a Master's of Divinity degree from Reformed Theological Seminary, where he was recognized with the rare 2 graduation awards, one in preaching and one in cross-cultural ministry. He earned his PhD from the University of Mississippi, studying race, religion, and social movements in the 20th century. The university awarded him a full merit-based scholarship, and he received numerous fellowship opportunities and a research grant. He was selected as the class marshal of his graduating class and gave a speech at commencement. Upon graduating, the School of Liberal Arts recognized him with the Graduate Achievement Award. I'm actually not going to read his whole Bible, but I want you to hear that part. His work has had profound impact on people. Like the president, I did not read the book. I listened to it 3 times. In 2021, he was named one of 21 faith leaders to watch by the Center for American Progress. As a podcaster, he spent 10 years co-hosting the Pass the Mic podcast and helped propel the Leave Loud campaign into a national spotlight, starting with the telling of his own story of leaving the Christian spaces he had fought so long to feel welcome to, instead began building his own table of hospitality for other Christians of color. Currently, he is a professor at Simmons College of Kentucky, a faith-based, historically black college university founded in 1879, where he teaches African American history. With his extensive experience and expertise in the field of racial justice and black history, he is a leader dedicated to helping others become the headlights shining the way forward on the journey of racial justice. Help me welcome Dr. Tisby. Okay, so hashtag MTSO no compromise. Will you bring in Dr. Carter? This is us.
I love it. It's so good to see y'all. Thank you for having me.
All right, Christopher.
All right, I'm just making sure everybody can hear me. All right, well, it's great to virtual. Well, I can see two of you, but I hear everybody else. So I feel as though I'm in the presence, in the company of everyone. Dr. Tisby, it was I had such an amazing opportunity to just read your book. So I actually did both. I both read it and listened to the audiobook while I was walking my dog, trying to make sure I got a chance to hear it from both perspectives. I had a couple of questions come to mind. Obviously, it brought up a lot as someone who's written and thought and taught about race myself. I think your historical perspective provided different kinds of insights, both personal narratives and stories that deepened, I think, our own, or I should say, as a person of color, as a Black American, my own particular experience, right? But one of the things that you start in the beginning, that you say almost in the very beginning of the book, is that the goal of the book was not to call out a specific group. And that for me was interesting. And I thought that was that. I wanted to ask you why that was the case. I have some suspicions, right? But I'm wondering if there's a particular reason you framed the book the way you did, because I suspect you could have written it in multiple ways.
Awesome. Thank you for that question. Why include a note about this isn't about calling out a particular group? Well, there's a couple of reasons. On a surface level, it's, as your professors, I'm sure, have you do when you write, anticipate objections. A lot of the introduction is anticipating objections. You got to understand, I come from a context in terms of Christianity is very conservative, almost fundamentalist in some senses. And what you would consider here at MTSO a very sort of rudimentary, kind of basic ideas about race and racism would sound absolutely incendiary to some of the folks I was in communication with, some of the folks who, because of those circles, would read my book and wouldn't read past the introduction. So part of it is to say, and I truly meant this wasn't just massaging something. What I truly wanted folks to understand, this is about truth-telling, not condemnation. And I go on in the introduction to talk about the difference between white guilt versus godly grief. So a lot of times people will read, and it didn't matter how I contextualized the book in the introduction, the criticism most frequently that came back was, oh, you just don't like white people. You don't like white Christians. Well, what about the abolitionists? That was the other favorite, right? But what I wanted to do from the outset was say, it's truly not about calling out a particular group. It's about calling us up into truth, into justice. And then I use that passage from 2 Corinthians where Paul's writing to a church, and he says, and he was very anxious because he had to correct them on some stuff. And he was very anxious about their response. And so they get the letter, and they actually listen to it. And they make some changes, and then he writes back. And he says, I rejoiced, not because you were grieved, I didn't want to cause you pain, but because you were grieved into repentance. right? And that's the point. It's not that, oh, I want you to feel bad because you're white. I want you to feel bad because the body of Christ is hurting. Because when one part of the body hurts, all of us do. When one part of the body rejoices, all of us should rejoice. But there is some grieving that has to come with it. There's no way, shape, or form that racism and white supremacy should not be a cause for us to grieve. But that's different than this sort of white guilt idea that people have. So,
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I assumed so. I grew up in West Michigan. West Michigan is almost it's so Dutch. Even the Methodist churches are basically reformed, right? And so I have an understanding of what you know a lot of the Calvinistic fundamentalist ways in which I suspect that you were raised, and so I assumed that was why you made that pivot. And yet I think there is still this part of me that recognizes one of the challenges I think we have that you named within Christianity is, well, I would say just within culture is what I might call language evasion, what actually Joe Fegan calls language evasion. And this happens a lot with patriarchy, where we use passive language to describe actions rather than holding people accountable. So for instance, with women and in issues of sexual assault, often the language that's used is it doesn't actually say something like it. Like campus will be like, oh, when I taught the University of San Diego, they'll say, well, this percentage of women experience have been assaulted on campus. And one of the things that I championed them to change the language of was to actually say, well, this percentage of women were actually assaulted by men. It's not that like some magic something, who was doing the assaulting. Like, let's actually use like active language. We teach to use active language and use active language. And similarly, I think there's a way in which I'm curious if you feel like there's a way in which to actually use the language of, as you said, not a calling out, perhaps a calling up, or as Loretta Ross frames like a calling in, an invitation to white Christians to say, this is where y'all have been compromised or have been complicit. And also the spaces that Black Christians have been called out, compromised, and complicit, because it is different, right? But the history of it says that there are those differences might need be named. And I'm curious if you were to, if you agree with that take, or if you disagree, like if you're like, well, maybe it's the most effective way is to actually keep it the language that it is, rather than the more precise language of identifying, hey, this group did, because you did that in multiple spaces. You're like, this is what this is what white people have done. But is it more about finding the way to say it that doesn't almost trigger them into retreating? And by them, I'm talking about white people, into retreating into themselves rather than engaging really the excellent arguments you make in the book.
yeah, so certainly the point about passive language is absolutely emphasized among historians. Stuff doesn't just happen. There are agents. And so as you get into the historical content of the book, I was very careful to make sure that there were specific actors named in each instance. If it didn't happen, it was more of an oversight than a trying to dodge or something. So the other part of this book in particular is it's published in a trade press and not an academic press. And that was purposeful. Number one, I never got a PhD to climb the tenure track ladder. That was never my goal or purpose. I wanted to get an advanced degree to learn research skills so that I could namely write, but also communicate in general about racial issues from a standpoint of information and knowledge, and not just spouting off hot takes and opinions, which I still do sometimes. But so in that sense, there's a pastoral element to it, which truly the introduction and the conclusion are the most pastoral sort of attempts in the book. The rest is a more straightforward history. So there's different purposes and functions within that. That being said, I don't think it would be any mystery to anybody who reads past chapter 2 who's doing what, right? And here's the thing. I think the impact of this book, which has been far exceeding any expectations I ever had, is the particular power of history to confront and convict. And what I love about history is I don't have to do a lot of, pounding the pulpit. I just tell the story. And the weight of the story inherently to the humble has this transformative effect. To the hard-headed, it has this like enraging effect. But it's the story that does the work. It's not me as the historian or the author. I can just tell you about Luther and Mary Turner and the lynching that occurred. I can just show you the Mississippi Articles of Secession, saying that our cause is thoroughly tied up with the institution of slavery. And that does the work. And I think what happened with this book is there weren't a ton of Christians who were writing from an academic historical background for a broader non-academic audience who were using history as a vehicle to talk about race at that time. And there's a whole lineage of scholars who have done this work, many of whom I cite in the book, but they were for more academic audiences. And I think this book just came along at a time when a sort of critical mass of people, folks like yourselves, were ready to hear it and read it.
Dr. Bridgeman, I have one more question before I let you. I'm sure you have questions you want to ask, but actually, I want to disagree with you, Dr. Tisby. I think the book, in multiple spaces, almost in every chapter, you slip into preaching. And it is obvious that you are a rhetoric, like that you love rhetoric. I mean, I'm reading this and I'm thinking, oh, I would definitely cite this passage. And then you cite it. And I was like, this is someone who preaches. Like, this is someone who knows how to use the stories we have to allow the weight of those stories to move people. And so yes, that is, I applaud you, like in terms of my reading of this book and listening to it, it has a narrative arc that's deeply, deeply compelling. And so I want to ask you actually a theological question, because there's something, I have it on page 54. Yeah, there's page 54 that there, I was actually listening to this, I had to come and find the page number, because there's something that the way it was in the conclusion of a chapter you wrote, that essentially there was a desire within many Christians to reform slavery rather than abolish slavery. And that really stood out with me. And I wondered, I wonder, it made me think about like if there is something in the theology, the way we think about and talk about and theologize about Christianity that leads us more towards reform rather than abolish, because we see this right now in the language we use, right, with respect to mass incarceration, with respect to the work I do is in issues of food justice and racial justice, and you see the ways you still see enslavement on essentially plantations today, right? The language of abolishment seems to really, as you write at the conclusion of the book, stir a lot of fear up in people. And so I'm wondering if you believe, or just in your own personal experience, if there's something about, or something within the theology of Christianity that perhaps pulls us more towards reform rather than abolish.
Ooh, you're trying to take me back to my seminary days.
I know.
So I mean, I think there's partly a socio-historical trajectory or way to answer that question, that typically the people who have called for radical reform, which we know the classic definition of radical is getting down to the root of a thing. Typically those people have been silenced pretty authoritatively, right? Killed in a lot of instances. Of course, you look at the slave rebellions, Denmark, BC, Nat Turner, you name it. What happened to the country that became Haiti, right? And the sanctions and the economic repercussions of enslaved people rebelling against their enslavement. So it's dangerous to call for abolition. It's dangerous to call for so-called radical change. That's one aspect of it. Another aspect is typically we are having to still work in partnership with white people who are much less willing to do the radical thing because they have some sort of stake in the status quo, whether that's financial or communal or whatever it might be. I wonder if theologically, there's a lot to go into it. One, we don't have a great, broadly speaking, there are pockets like this one. We don't have a great understanding of justice, especially as it applies to issues of our day, right? It's an abstract concept for a lot of people. I'm telling you, I mean, just even the conversations we're having here at this school are so far beyond what is happening at a typical church or even seminary. And it's hard when you're in it, when you're like at this school, to have that perspective, but I hear from these folks often. And this is very refreshing, actually, to be in a place that's taking this seriously, not in terms of just an intellectual theological pursuit, but in terms of praxis and practice. So I don't think there is a great theology around justice in a lot of circles that would lead people to say some things need to be torn down, and then we need to rebuild something new. And so we need more people like that. And by the way, I'll just put this plug in my opinion, the most direct link to race-based chattel slavery is modern-day mass incarceration. There's a lot of legacies of race-based chattel slavery. The thing I think, it's of course in the Constitution, although the word is never mentioned, it's protected for 20 years. You can't talk about slavery until 1808. There's the 3/5 clause to determine representation in slaveholding states. Numerous other ways that the Constitution protected this because it's a money-making endeavor, which is one of the legacies, which is about reparations, which we won't get into till later. But the thing with mass incarceration is it literally controls people's physical bodies in ways that other injustices don't. Not that they're not negative or harmful, but from policing, where a traffic stop can literally be a death sentence, to jails and prisons, where I've taught for several years, and grown men, and I've been in male prisons, you see this dichotomy. You see this spirit of pride and rebellion, knowing I'm a human being and I deserve a certain kind of treatment, but also the repression that has led to a sense of, if I buck up, if I resist, if I kick against the goads at all, they have all the power. And so grown men asking to use the bathroom, being referred to as inmate, and not by their name. So those kinds of things, as I look at the legacy of race-based chattel slavery, that helps us think of in terms of abolition and radical change, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Carter, for getting us started. Now, those of you who have questions, there are mics, and you don't get the privilege of doing what Dr. Carter did, that is contextualizing your question. You don't, that was his job. Your job is to state your question. And if Dr. Tisby wants clarification, he'll ask for it. So those of you who know that you have questions, you can go to the mics now, and we're gonna start. And don't be shy to get to the mic, because we have limited time. So if you sitting there thinking, I don't wanna be first, get over it.
Dr. Bridgeman, there's one thing I want to say as we invite people to come up with their questions, is I hope those of you who feel like a call to pastoral ministry or a call to preaching really take seriously what Dr. Tisby just said about the importance of being able to articulate a way, a theology of justice, a theology of accountability, a theology, honestly, that deals with race in its truth, but can talk about it in a way that your congregations can actually understand it. Because I think that many of us we can leave seminary with the ability to understand these difficult concepts. But I think you so expertly describe some of the challenges of translating those concepts to people in ways that inspire them and help them understand and deepen their own capacities, rather than just feeling as though you're just, talking over their head. And so I thought that was just an excellent answer. That is one of, just as someone who's currently a full-time pastor, to really encourage y'all to take that challenge seriously.
And I will make this 2 examples. One is that in Philadelphia, Dr. Leslie Dawn Callahan is the pastor at St. Paul's Baptist Church. When I was there, she never did a teaching on inclusive language. But those of us who were in the pulpit, she said, you better not get up and not use inclusive language in worship and in meetings. And I remember the day that 76-year-old, this is why when people tell me my people won't do it, I just go, no, because you won't model it and you won't teach it. 76-year-old Deacon Jackson got up and corrected his language in the middle of making an announcement, and used inclusive language, not because somebody had taught him, but because he had seen it modeled. Part 2, Dr. Gino Gibson is sitting here, and I have watched him take a 100-plus-year-old church and shift some theology, a Baptist church, where people would have said, too conservative, too blah blah, too whatever, that could never happen. And I asked him, what happened? He said, I believed it. So my point is, if the pastor believes it and is willing to take those kinds of risks and pull people along, not pull, but let people follow them into this journey, I'm telling you, they don't even know why they changed. They don't, but they have. I know they have, because I've seen them change. So Ronisha, and then Daniel, and then Shema.
All right, thank you, Ronisha Waring, and then Inez. So my question is, what is the color of compromise?
Nice. That's actually the subject of the book talk I give on it. And there's something called an Audible original that you can get that is that book talk. And so I argue that the color of compromise is actually 3 colors. It's green to represent greed that was behind race-based chattel slavery and its legacies. It is white to represent the ideology of white supremacy that undergirds this narrative of racial difference. And it is red to symbolize the violence and the literal bloodshed that always accompanies the greed and the white supremacy of it. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Daniel.
I'll be brief, Dean. So I loved your call for a civil rights movement within the church, and I would love to hear you elaborate on it more in practical ways.
It's highly contextual, but in calling for a civil rights movement toward the church, I have 2 things in mind. Number 1, change starts in your own house. I think a lot of people are turning away from Christianity, turning away from the church, because in general, the impression is we're good at pointing fingers to others and criticizing them without a similar scrutiny on our own selves and our own practices. Secondly, in calling for a civil rights movement toward the church, I literally mean employing direct action nonviolence tactics, right? So sit-ins, boycotts, marches, protests toward the church, particularly around ongoing issues of racial injustice. So again, it is highly contextual. It might be a particular church, a particular denomination, and if we are seeing these things, it comes out of a frustration that we're not seeing much change. We're not seeing enough change. And we're seeing some churches, and I would add Christian colleges, universities, and seminaries, actually position and brand themselves as resisting racial progress. In other words, that's how they get donors. That's how they get money. That's how they get more students, is to show how not woke they are. And so they strip away their DEI offices, they disempower, they literally defund these efforts. And it's happening over and over and over again. And the question is, how much are we going to allow that to happen among those who call the name of Christ, call themselves Christians? And I think the civil rights movement was, in a broad sweep, a demonstration, right? It was literally meant to demonstrate the injustice of racism and segregation and broadcast that to the world. And what would it look like for Christians to demonstrate toward churches, toward denominations, that provides an alternative witness to say that this thing that you're seeing, this horrible behavior that you're seeing, is not the sum total of Christianity. In fact, there is another voice, there is another witness.
Amen. And then Gino, and then Courtney.
Are we limited to one question?
This time. Pull the mic down so the question comes in.
So you mentioned that churches could pool resources to fund a debt forgiveness plan for Black families. Are there legal requirements for this, or is it entirely up to the church?
Not a policy or legal expert. I think that where there's a will, there's a way. I don't think that we would face many impediments in pooling resources together. If there's debt, the person collecting the debt or the organization just wants the money. They don't care where it comes from, generally.
Before the next person asks their question, I have a story for you about that. In Austin, there was a church. I'm not going to name the denomination, but they had a sister church across town on the east side. So white church had a sister church that was Black on the east side. They invited me into a conversation, the white church invited me into a conversation, and they were fighting over spending $2 million to do covered over their walkways for when it rained. And they asked me, what do you think I should do? And I said, buy some umbrellas for $1,000 and give your sister congregation $1,905,000. Yeah. Anyway.
I like that. I like that.
Dr. Tisby, wonderful book, man. It's blown me away. I can't wait to talk to you when you sign my book and all of those things. Just a little context, Dr. Valerie. On January 20th.
You just can't help yourself.
I can't. No, but seriously, January 20th, 1981, my dad broke down crying. Watched him cry. I was 9 years old. He was crying because Ben Vereen performed at Ronald Reagan's inauguration. Of course, they cut the second part out. So he just looked like he did blackface, but he didn't show the fact that he was going against the whole institution. As a result, he was castigated, pushed aside by Black community, and then left by the white community as well. Chrisette Michele performed for Donald Trump. Same thing happened to her. What do you say about how the establishment will use the gifts and agencies of the African American performers, but then when they use them up, get rid of them, and then mess them up, and all of those things that happened to Dr. Jeremiah Wright and others, that kind of thing. So what do you just say to that?
That was a good conversation.
So it's about the exploitation, if you will, blaxploitation. That opportunity or temptation to be exploited will always be there. And we as Black folks have to be on guard about it. In my view, every Black person is trying to deal with white supremacy. Most of us deal with it by resisting it. Some of us deal with it by assimilating into it and accommodating it because you reap the rewards of it. so long as you're on their good list. What I try to say is it is always conditional. Y'all might remember what happened to Omarosa. Summarily dismissed. Because this skin of ours will always be a mark for them, for those who buy into this idea of white supremacy. Which means if you buy into the ideology, you can gain conditional or provisional acceptance. But you must assimilate, you must check all the boxes. And the moment you don't, the moment you remember you're black, you can be dismissed. And I think we also need to have a nuanced understanding, not to excuse it, but to say there are people whose paychecks are on the line, who have families to raise, because we did the Leave Loud campaign, right? Where we were like, you know what? When people show you who they are, believe them the first time, right? And a lot of stuff has come out from in the last 10, 15 years, and especially with the election of the 45th president. So we were saying, y'all, why are you still there? I mean, you know what they're about at this point, right? And it was helpful feedback for us to hear from folks who felt a genuine calling to these places. Like it was part of their ministry, a Jonah type of situation where they felt called to a Nineveh in the white church. I'm like, okay. Those calls tend, what I've said, yeah, exactly. It's a hard calling if that's your calling. So I don't condemn people for choosing what they choose. I'm just trying to make sure we're honest about what's happening. You know what I mean? It's like, all right, you're in this very questionable white institution. You're trying to work within it, but just be real about how they're viewing you, about the amount of change they're willing to make. And if you still feel called there, blessings to you. I will pray for and with you. But let's not pretend as if they're further along than they are or more willing than they are.
Right. Courtney and then Jim.
Thank you. Courtney Williams, second semester MDiv.
Thank you.
Over dinner this evening, we talked about the importance of praxis, doing over just reading and learning, and how this campus encourages the praxis of what we say we believe. I grew up in Alabama.
Question.
Here it comes. Here it comes.
No.
Here it comes.
Question.
How do you handle, particularly people in the South, where they have, racism in their blood? It has gone back from the beginning, so anything is an attack on them personally and their family.
I spent 20 years in the Deep South, and I'm talking Deep South, the Delta. One author called it the most southern place on earth. It's cotton country, literally. Cotton's blooming right now, October, early November. Here's my take. There are people who have hearts of stone, and the Bible reminds us to pray that they would have hearts of flesh. Mark chapter 6. It's a fine line. If you want my honest answer, there's not a lot we can do in the flesh. I treat them like folks who don't know Jesus. Because how can you love God and hate your neighbor? That's what we're dealing with. We think we're dealing with, oh, I just need to assemble the right arguments, facts, and figures, and that'll persuade them. It ain't an intellectual thing. It's a spiritual thing. It's a moral thing. It's an ethical thing. And we cannot fight with the weapons just of this world that are purely carnal. We have to pray through this. We have to think about this theologically. And I know we are on this social justice kick, and we got to change the laws. We got to change the policies. We got to change the systems. But Jesus, he's about changing you. So what I gotta say is it's us that God is working on. So here's the thing. As you become healthier in your understandings of justice, as you walk further with Jesus, as your heart gets changed into a heart of flesh and not a heart of stone, you will be the aroma of Christ to others around you, which means you're going to be a stench to some. So, y'all, we need to get stinky for Jesus. What I'm persuaded by is that the more we look like Jesus, the more changes we'll see in the world that we want to see. But we got to understand this is a spiritual battle in addition to an earthly one. And as we get sucked down into the muck and the mire of the day-to-day and dealing with people, and trust me, this is one of the things that living in the South has shown me, people's whole identities are wrapped up in the idea of white centrality, white supremacy. They would never put it that way. But you can see it the moment it's threatened.
Right.
The moment there's a black president. The moment there's calls for reform to the so-called law and order structure. The moment there's a conversation about redistribution of resources that have been hoarded for generations. Then their reaction isn't just, I disagree with you. The reaction is, I feel attacked. My identity is attacked. So we have to have that understanding. I don't think we are going to persuade everyone, but I think our most persuasive witness is that we look, walk, talk, and smell like Jesus.
And if we become a colony of that, a fifth column in the world, then change happens not because of individual persons, but because there is actually a dispatch.
Is there a question there?
No, because I'm the conversation partner. Any questions? Jim, and then Jackson.
What is, you've shown yourself as being knowledgeable about the past. You're obviously insightful about the present. Where do you see us about 100 years out?
Should the Lord tarry?
Thank you.
So, I mean, it's always dangerous for a historian
You a seer now.
to prognosticate about the future. What I see are increasing, what's happening right now that I anticipate will continue to happen is a sifting in the church and the culture. So, the folks who are committed to a racial status quo or even a regressive vision of going back to times when we had less freedoms, they're digging their heels in by and large, and their institutions are becoming more ossified. And the people within those institutions who disagree, and even just by a little bit, are getting pushed out or choosing to leave. So what I anticipate is a further separation and sifting. By the way, I don't think it's polarization. I don't think it is a both sides thing. I think there's a polarization that's happening to a more extreme extent on the right. They're moving the goalposts of what counts as orthodox or acceptable. I think that's going to continue to happen. I think we're just globally seeing a rise in authoritarianism, a resurgence of it, particularly politically. And I believe we are living in a period of history where, in a way that we maybe haven't seen in a few decades, where the church is really going to have to be the church. We're going to have to provide a very countercultural example to what we're seeing in the broad public. And I also don't see, honestly, things getting dramatically better quickly. What I do see is an opportunity for the church to shine more brightly than we have. So y'all get in your prayer closets and you get with each other, because like you said, it's really a community witness. I don't anticipate things getting easier in the short term, but I do anticipate us feeling God's presence nearer as we attempt to live that out his call, God's call.
Jackson and then Tim.
Kid Bridgeman, please don't look at me, because I might forget my question. Thank you so much, Dr. Tisby. This book, by the way, I think Dr. Carter was right about you. This book has made me understand the history of America. I need to say this because I'm not an American, but the thing is, this book is really hard to read. The things that you've written in here, they're so hard. So my question to you is, when you were writing this book, how has it affected you? Because it is too much.
It is hard to read, and it should be hard to read because it's horrific. We don't use that word sin much, do we? But dadgum, what is racism? And it's not racism, not an idea, it's an action. So as we look at these actions, it should be hard to read. One of the things that really stuck out to me, there's all these historical facts in there, but one that really stuck out to me was in the chapter on the colonial era, the Virginia Assembly in 1667, writing that law that said baptism would not emancipate an indigenous, mixed race, or African descent person. That stuck out to me because the chronology. This is 1667, more than a century before the Declaration of Independence, more than a century before the ratification of the Constitution. So it predates this political entity we know as the United States. So there's no era in history where America was great on these things that we can go back to, right? Secondly, it's the intertwining of race, religion, and politics. So you have this political body, the Virginia Assembly, making a law respecting religion, baptism, that was racially coded in terms of who it affected. So you can study those things separately, but you can never separate them. Right. Race, religion, and politics, part of our justice call, right? What I learned, it made me bolder. Because when you see the injustices that have been heaped upon people of African descent and other people of color throughout literal centuries, you get very impatient. MLK talked about the fierce urgency of now. And that's what I felt. Because I had been gaslit for so long by white Christians, saying you're making too big a deal of this, you're too sensitive, I didn't mean it that way. All of these things they do to try to take the sting and the hurt and the pain and the trauma of racism away or minimize it, I started saying, no, that doesn't fly. That does not work because I know the history. And the other thing it taught me was you can see things in their seed form and what the fruit will lead to, what the fruit will eventually be. So it can be a comment. It can be on the surface, race-neutral policy, but you can see how that thing will expand and how it will grow to harm other people if it's not addressed in its seminal form, in its seed form. So I think those are two ways that it really changed my perspective.
Tim, and then Rosemary. And then literally Rosemary gets the last question. Dr. Christopher is going to say something, and Dr. Tisby is going to say something, and we're going to say amen. And then he's going to go out and sign books and sell T-shirts. So let me ask you this before are we doing it, do you have Venmo, Cash App, or do you want money?
Cashless is preferred.
Cashless is preferred, so, okay.
Right.
Which is not the same thing as saying he won't take your money.
So Dr. Tisby, Tim Van Meter, I'm on the faculty here. So part of how racism is perpetuated in the academic structure is in a soft way, where we talk about rigor. We treat people as if the discipline we were trained in does not change. And we evaluate their portfolios, we evaluate their CVs through a white, normative, heterosexist lens. We're in several searches right now. I don't know that yet, we're not in the place where we're asking the questions as fully as we should. What does it mean to shift the academy towards a vision of anti-racist?
That's good. Yeah, the two slowest institutions to change in my experiences are the church and the academy. Oh yeah. So you're at the intersection of both of these things. It's going to be a long haul. One of the things I think we need to do is think in the long term. And so you're talking about, sort of changing the landscape of it. I mean, that means, I think, tapping folks in college to say, hey, have you thought about seminary? Have you thought about academic theology? Let us sort of help you on a pathway that may take 7, 8 years to bear fruit, but that's how deep the issue goes. So what does it look like to really start further back and not just recruiting folks who are already in the stage where they can come to seminary or theological school? The other, I think, is by demonstration. So one of my big frustrations is that the academy only counts certain things as academic work. So the color of compromise doesn't count as academic work in a lot of people's minds. It wasn't by a university press, it was for a popular audience, it actually sold, and most academic books don't. And by the way, academics are some of the pettiest folks, and I think there's something about...
You're right!
I mean, the level of jealousy and backbiting and all that, I think there's something about the actual context and culture of it that actually somehow breeds and encourages that. So, in my view, what's been most helpful is by demonstrating different ways of applying your scholarship, particularly beyond the academy, right? And so now we do have people like Annette Gordon-Reed, who wrote a book on Juneteenth that did really well and was very helpful. We have folks like Kristen Kobes-Dumay's book, which is thoroughly academic, but has also had a large social impact. We have folks who are online on Instagram or TikTok or whatever your chosen medium is. Substack is mine, jemartisby.substack.com. It's, I mean, whatever you like. So you cannot wait for permission to do the right thing. You've got a calling. And I just think it's bonkers that academics who have this really fine-grained, detailed information about a specific field are expected to keep it within this circle of maybe 15 or 20 people in the world who know your subject. And it's also a myopic view of scholarship because most of the time, Black scholars get into it because of a justice focus. This is why W.E.B. Du Bois wrote Black Reconstruction, to correct a false historical narrative about the Reconstruction era. One person told me, and I'll never forget, that all scholarship is autobiographical. Whatever you choose for your thesis, for your book topic, for your dissertation, it probably has some intersection with your life and what happened in it. I don't see why we shouldn't share that broadly and why we shouldn't use our expertise to do good in the world, especially Christian scholars. But I think we have to lead by example. I don't think the academy institutionally is going to pick up on those changes on its own.
Rosemary, you get the last question.
Thank you. I am a foreigner. I can only imagine what it has felt for the Black Americans. I do not have the experience. So my question is, as a foreigner, what is my responsibility in the fight against complicity?
Thank you for that question. By the way, where did you grow up, if I may ask? Where did you grow up?
Kenya.
Very good, thank you. I've been to South Africa, which is an absolute trip, racially speaking. It was wild. And Benin in West Africa, one of the ports, one of the slave ports. And it's a beautiful thing to be Black and in the majority. As an American, it is refreshing and empowering. And I think that's part of what is difficult for folks who are not from the US to come into, because they're coming in many cases from majority Black contexts. And they're still subject to colonialism and white supremacy in various ways. So I still think you have that understanding. I think here is the first task is understanding and awareness, right? The dynamics here are different. particularly, how do we underplay race-based chattel slavery? Like, I think we severely underplay its impact on our nation and particularly on concepts of race. But human beings were considered property. And it took, to this day, the nation's bloodiest war to finally bring about the abolition of slavery. It didn't come through the legislative process alone. It didn't come through newspapers and writing. It literally came through a bloody conflict with nearly 1 million people killed and the rending of the political fabric of this nation. How do we underplay that? And how then do we underplay its legacy today? Then no matter what area, it's a beautiful thing y'all are doing with eco-justice here. But even there, we can see the racialized dimensions of it. Banking, incarceration, I don't care, academy, what area you name, it all still falls predictably along racial lines, which is the definition of racialization, which is what Emerson and Smith talk about in their book, Divided by Faith. So I think the first thing is to understand a racialized society. That no matter how hard you work, you will have stereotypes and expectations and limits placed upon you because you have darker skin. I think a second call is to talk to other people who share your culture and background and help them understand. Because I think there's actually a lot of damage that can be done by Black folks and people of color who haven't grown up here, who don't have the context, and who buy into sort of the American dream of you have so much opportunity here. All you have to do is come here and work hard until you get pulled over. Till your daughter is the one Black gymnast who gets skipped over with the medals. Y'all see that? Right? It always comes back to remind you and to understand that context and to help other people understand. So I think those are a couple of things we can do, but there's a long tradition of Pan-Africanism and global solidarity that we need to tap into as well. So it's incumbent upon us as Black folks in the US to recognize our solidarity with the global population of people of African descent.
Thank you. Dr. Christopher?
Well, I just want to close by saying thank you so much for such an amazing conversation, Dr. Tisby. I really wish I had was able to be there because I have a page full of questions that you can't see, but like literally just so I was like, well, these are the ones I think are most interesting. I want you to know that I know you mentioned something about or maybe Dr. Bridgeman mentioned that the food that you say you didn't miss the meat. Now that I will say is a part of my influence on the campus over the years, where I make this argument about Black veganism as an anti-racist praxis because of the ways in which the animalization of Black people is tied, the animalization of Black people is tied to the legacy of slavery and the theological ramifications of that. So this is a campus that tries to live out our call to dismantle oppression in all its various ways. I want to close by noting there are so many times you mentioned spaces that made me think of the trauma of racism as an internalized trauma that we all carry, both Black people and white people, that manifest differently, whether you're talking about Omarosa or Clarence Thomas or whoever it is, right? That's literally carrying this kind of trauma. But also when you mentioned the color of compromise being green, I'm thinking about prosperity gospel Black pastors, right? That are also doing something similar and harming their congregations by propagating these other kinds of myths. It just reminded me the importance of calling out racism and race-based thinking as sin and using that language. And those students in my theology class, we just had a whole session on sin. So we do talk about sin. And we talk about sin as a failure to love. And I think this ties into, broadly speaking, with the actions that you end your book with. Each one is a way in which to embody this solidaristic love praxis of Jesus is how I would phrase it. And so thank you so much for the work. Thank you for this amazing text, and I look forward to being in conversation with you, hopefully in person at some point. And Dr. Bridgman, thank you for allowing me to be a part of that conversation. Even I'm in Southern California. I live in LA So I'm not dealing with the cold front. Apparently, y'all got down there. It's like 85 degrees, but hopefully y'all hanging in there.
Dr. Tisby, I also want to offer my thanks on behalf of the institution for your willingness to drive up from Louisville and to come. I told him that you all were great at hospitality, and so far you have proved me right. Don't end it at the table. And also just to say, this commitment we have is an ongoing commitment. Nobody here is trying to say we got it down pat. Because racism is in the air and in the water, in the DNA of this country, and we are all affected by it. And your book helped remind us of that, and then recommit those of us who can to doing something about it. So would you say the last thing you want to say and pray us out of here? And then we won't get up and go until you find yourself at the table. And introduce Izzy. I know she may already be at the table, but would
Come
you?
on out, Izzy. This is Izzy Webster. She's our merchandise associate. She'll be helping out at the table, and she was kind enough to join us on this trip. So she's an integral part of making this happen. Thank you, Izzy. I want to say a couple of things. I'm going to try to be brief. I will be. Number one, what we mentioned at the dinner this evening is that justice isn't the destination, justice is the journey. So we're constantly iterating, we're constantly learning. None of us have it down such that we can stop and say, okay, I got the degree, I'm done. Come to me, I'm an expert. We're constantly learning. It's a journey, and we'll refine and get better as we continue on that journey. My second book, which is on sale out there, is called How to Fight Racism, Courageous Christianity, and the Journey Toward Racial Justice. Courageous Christianity in contrast to a complicit or a compromised Christianity, and the journey toward racial justice as a nod to the fact that we're all on the way. We're all still figuring this out. And also, for a group like this, where you have an actual degree in social justice offered, right? It is incumbent on us not to be condescending toward those who don't have the same understanding. That's one of the hardest things to do. But as we conceptualize this as a journey, you may be further ahead, but at one point you were probably back there too. And so the question is, what will you do with those who are back there? Now they're still on the journey. There are some who are way off in the field somewhere. The best we can do is be like, yo, the path is here. Come on. No? All right, I'll see you later. But there are some who are back there. So to the white folks, some of your very difficult call will be to other white folks who ain't where you are. To Black folks and people of color, I think our call is to solidarity with each other. I would really like to add to, in my How to Fight Racism book, there's something called, I introduced it in Color Compromise, the arc of racial justice, awareness, relationships, commitment. I would really like to add an element of the relationship to the land and our ecology, right? But also in that section is about solidarity with one another. We go further together. And it's Indigenous Peoples Day. How are we as Black folks partnering with, allying with the original inhabitants of this land, as well as people of Latin descent, as well as people of Asian descent? What does that look like? Which, by the way, I'll tell other people of color not of African descent. What has always led the way to greater rights for everyone is greater rights for Black people. We don't really want to hear or say that. But again, we underplay the role of race-based chattel slavery. It's not because there's something special in the melanin in our skin. It's because so much of the history of this country was tied to the exploitation of Black people that when we rise, all of us rise. Right? So it's about solidarity in those senses. And the last thing I'll say is this. The most frequent charge I give to people, and the most important virtue, I think, in this racial justice struggle is courage. When you're in a context where everybody sort of is on the same page, justice is important. Let's learn about it. Let's do it. Good. We need that. But you will certainly be, if you continue on this journey, in a context where to pursue justice is going to cost you. Some of you have already experienced this, or you're experiencing it now. It's going to cost you family members and relationships. It's going to cost you jobs. It's going to cost you invitations. It's going to cost you reputation. That's when you know what your true commitment to justice is, and that's when courage is necessary. And the one testimony I can give you is this. I always go back to the verse from Joshua 1:9 that says, "Be strong and very courageous." That's the command, but there's a promise attached to it. For I will be with you wherever you go. That's the promise. God doesn't call you to be courageous alone. God calls you to be courageous, and God promises God's presence. And some of you are discouraged now. Some of you, your faith life feels brittle and hollow right now. What I can guarantee from experience is that the more you follow Jesus, and to follow Jesus means to follow justice, the more of Jesus you get. Oh, we overcomplicate this, don't we? My caution to you is don't make this only about justice. You have a reason you pursue justice, because justice is embodied in Jesus. So if you forget the person of Jesus, you can do good in the world. That's great. But what makes it Christian is you follow Christ. And it's because of Christ that you do justice. Don't hear me say, oh, I'm not a Christian, you can't do good in the world. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if you call yourself Christian, then the center of your faith is not a principle, but a person. It's not an idea. It's an embodied person. And as you pursue Jesus' call to justice, as you heed Jesus' command to be strong and courageous, guess what you get? Not more of this world. You get more of Jesus. And that's better. I can't tell you what it's cost me. That'll be my next book. But what I can tell you is what I've gained. Oh, sweetness and nearness of Jesus that gives me tingles to talk about. Intimacy with God. With God, the Creator. Lord. And that's what keeps you going. You're going to lose a lot. Oh, but you'll gain so much more. That's my time.